the way I describe the book is, in the blurb that you all have, was keying in on the problem of empathy. And it turned out, you write books for long periods of time, and when they land is somewhat of an accident, but it so happened, I think, that things were very keyed up around this topic, this term. So I thought I'd say a few things about that as a way of framing what I think is happening for my thinkers and the way they're understanding the role of emotions in public life more generally. So I wanted to read you a few headlines from the last couple years. So, empathy is dead in American politics. New York Magazine, 2017. We need empathy in the age of Trump. Huffington Post, 2016. We're not even in the age of Trump in 2016. We are overdosing on empathy. The Guardian. Shocker, empathy drops 40% in college students since 2000. Psychology Today. Is empathy dead? Forbes. Empathy, the most valuable thing they teach at Harvard Business School. Harvard Business Review. In Syria attack, Trump's heart came first. So what I want to indicate by the locations of all these things is how widespread the interest in empathy is. I want to suggest how elevated our expectations are for its efficacy as a political moral tool. And I want to suggest how confused we are. In Syria attack, Trump's heart came first. The fact that the New York Times can say this, and I think it's perfectly self-evident that you can bomb something out of your heartfelt love for something, is an indication of where we are in thinking about the role of the heart. In response, I put into Google, in response to teaching empathy, which has been much discussed in the Academy for the last, I would say, almost 20 years, there are 49 million hits. So Harvard Business School actually was running a course on empathy and management. And so it's everywhere, and I think it also is maybe not fully digested as a term. We have a lot of expectations for it, but maybe not a deep understanding of it. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the history of that word. Empathy is coined in the late 19th century, and it is meant to describe a physiological capacity, a capacity of the nervous system, and it's 100% a physical thing. And it's related to emotions. It's a way that emotions are conducted through the body and from bodies to other bodies. It has no psychological apparatus whatsoever. That changes when, well, it sort of changes. In the early 20th century, psychologists and aestheticians, people thinking about art, adopted the term to describe the process of projecting oneself into and identifying so wholly with an object that you fully understand it. I want to just point out that we're talking about an object. We're talking about Keats' Grecian urn, not other people. So it's about relating to artworks, paintings, books, whatever, music maybe. It's not until 1946 that the term starts to change to its contemporary meaning, the one that we recognize. And first, it's just in a specialized discourse of psychology, and it's about entering fully into the experience and feelings of other people. It then rockets upward in usage in the 1950s, and the rate of increase in usage never slows down. It doesn't plateau. We're still going up this way in its usage. So it became something, I think, incredibly useful. And so part of my book might address why in the 1950s and ever after, very more rapidly, empathy started to be a term that we felt we had to use and seemed so valuable. Because in contrast, the women of my book are going to sense this turn toward emotions as a political and aesthetic tool and resist it. So the idea that we are only now encountering this flooding of the public sphere with feelings of various kinds is not a phenomenon of the last 20 years, but a phenomenon that actually dates back to the emergence of tremendous, overwhelming suffering after World War II. The Holocaust, for instance, is not really properly started to grapple with until the early 1960s. And Hiroshima has perhaps never been fully grappled with. But we don't really treat these things for about 50, there's a kind of time lag for how we treat enormous and overwhelming suffering that really begins more or less in the early 1960s. But indications of that turn are fully visible to different people. So the reason I ended up writing about the women in my book is that I was interested in the scandals of tone that they produced. I was suspicious myself that empathy could do all the things we think it can do. If you wanted to look for scandal of tone, it turned out you better look for women writers. You're not really going to find men castigated for their failure of feeling in very many places. So one of the first things, I can't say actually this was the first, but one of the first things I looked at was Eichmann in Jerusalem and the response to Eichmann in Jerusalem, about which a great deal has been written. And what interested me, and this is where I want to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that I gleaned around unsentimentality from these different writers. What interested me was Hannah Arendt's embrace of the term heartless that was leveled against her by a friend, Gershom Scholem, who thereafter was less of a good friend. So he called her heartless. And she said, "You're right, I am heartless." And she defined that in two different ways. She said, "I don't have a love for the people," and many of you may know this particular quote. "I can only love things in their particularity, and the heart is used to cover, the tact of the heart, which is one of its meanings, is used to cover up unpleasant realities." One of her principal charges in Eichmann and in much of her work is to face reality. So what does that mean? For her, it meant not facing the suffering of the other, that this was actually not where you got to the problem. You got swept away in certain kinds of emotional complications. So two things that she writes right around the same time. She's editing On Revolution, which is her book about the French and American revolutions, as she is attending the Eichmann trial and sending her first dispatches to the New Yorker, which is where it was originally published. And so those ideas are very present to her. And so she's describing what she understood as the boundlessness of something like empathy or sympathy. So she thought that the problems with empathy were threefold. One, that the heart, that it was used to euphemize what was happening in some real situation, and that it was more paying attention more to the feelings of the listener than the actuality that you're trying to talk about. So it was distorting. She said it's always unknowable in On Revolution, in that it produces a problem of hypocrisy. Her argument was that the heart is hidden, and so the only way, you can't verify it. And so it actually injects a kind of doubt into the testimony of heart, because you can't verify it, and then you get the problem of hypocrisy enters the scene. And that empathy is unpredictably motivating. So that if the French revolutionaries could be overcome by their feelings for the masses of poor in Paris, and that feeling could overwhelm principle and lead to the terror, which is basically her argument in On Revolution, it was not similarly motivating for the American revolutionaries, that the suffering of black suffering in slavery was not symmetrically motivating. It had no role whatsoever in their framing of the Constitution. Now, she actually approves of this because she wants to argue for principle and not for emotion as a foundation of the Republic. But it is also important to recognize that she didn't think that suffering would automatically elicit any particular response, much less a particularly good one, that it was actually highly volatile in its effects and highly uneven in its ability to compel a witness of some kind. So that's one set of problems that the book talks about. As I was working on the book, I realized that there really isn't an account of unsentimentality in literary criticism, cultural criticism. We have massive bookcases full of accounts of the sentimental. And that really started with feminist criticism in the 80s, reclaiming the sentimental as something worthy of examination. So basically, what do you do with Uncle Tom's Cabin, perhaps the most significant book of the late 19th century, if you can't have an account of what sentimental literature does and how it works? So then, ever since, there's been a great deal of interest and discussion of this. But no matter where you look, if you also philosophers thinking about Adam Smith in the 18th century and moral sentiment, there's all kinds of work in these areas. But even though from modernism till now, unsentimentality is the mode of serious work, we don't know what it is. And I want to argue, and I do argue in the book, is that it's not the absence of something. It's not the absence of inappropriate feeling. It's not the absence of exaggerated feeling. It's not the absence of maudlin or melodramatic feeling. It's actually the presence of something else. And this is what I'm trying to articulate. What actually is sentimentality? Unsentimentality? How could it be useful to us? And the way I see it in different ways throughout the book is that it's a sort of discipline of perception and representation. I think empathy has a sentimental fantasy in it. And I think empathy is used, like we don't say sympathy anymore because we understand the asymmetry of sympathy. We say, oh, well, sympathy is the powerful for the powerless. But in fact, empathy works exactly the same way in the way that we use it. Maybe not technically if you went back to certain things. So I think empathy is our more sophisticated way of pulling in the vectors of sentimentality into our emotional life. And our public emotional life. I don't think it's absolutely 100% identical with sympathy and sentiment, but I think it's in the constellation of concepts that go with that. So empathy should technically mean only one thing, and that is that you fully understand and perceive the other person's point of view. It doesn't say that you have any particular feeling about what you see, right? It should not technically mean that you care or that you have or that you're motivated to action by seeing this. It really should be defined by your ability, strictly speaking, but that is not the way we use it. That is not how it operates in our contemporary public discourse. It operates more around the empathy would automatically compel a certain kind of relationship to suffering. And the point here is that it actually doesn't. And so that if on the other side of this constellation of concepts that belong together with sentimentality, empathy, sympathy, we have something broad and undefined called unsentimentality. And not everything. So you can say something is non-sentimental, which means it doesn't. So you could say that the emotions in a non-sentimental, there are emotions in the non-sentimental work, but they're properly scaled and they're adequate to the situation, so that they don't suffer from the scalar problem of sympathy or sentiment, which is that their sentimental literature has gone off the scale of reaction between the situation and the emotions exhibited about the situation. So non-sentimental would merely mean the emotion's there, but it's good. We approve of the way that it's used. Where I would say unsentimental is something different, and when it fails, and it fails with these women frequently, that's why you have the scandals, it veers into the realm of coldness, tactlessness, brutality, as opposed to merely, it moves towards the other end of the scale. So I want to talk about, here's one aspect of Arendt's view of this. There's a lot more in that book about the style of representation, where she talks about a particular witness's report of his experience in the Holocaust that she feels produces something like an unsentimental version of talking about not suffering, but the conditions that produce suffering. So those style questions go all through the book. So I want to turn a little bit to her good friend Mary McCarthy, because this in the pairing of McCarthy and Hannah Arendt, we have Arendt sort of articulating a political philosophy of unsentimentality, with McCarthy trying to understand its aesthetic practices. So if Arendt would always say, well, you have to face reality, McCarthy will talk about facing facts. And McCarthy, do people know Mary McCarthy's work? She's less, some people, young people are like, I have no idea who that you're talking about, and older people are like, of course, the group. McCarthy was an essayist and a novelist and a critic and an autobiographer and memoirist. And she's known today principally for her memoirs, I think, more than her fiction. The group is read pretty widely, but not nearly as much as Memoirs of Catholic Girlhood or something like that. So that's who McCarthy was. But she was a really important critic, and her friendship with McCarthy was a really interesting one. So facing facts is something that's all through her work, and I want to talk a little bit about that, but I want to use an image from that chapter, from her encounter with Hannah Arendt, to try to describe what kind of relationship they wanted to create. So when Hannah and Mary met each other for the first time, they had a terrible encounter. They were both mutually offended and more or less wouldn't speak to each other. 6 years later, they're on a subway platform after a meeting at Politics, so they were constantly in each other's company. At a meeting at Politics, which was a little magazine at the time. A little magazine is just a small circulation magazine. It doesn't mean it's like tiny. But those were very potent things. And they met on a subway, and Hannah Arendt said to McCarthy, we need to stop this. We think too much alike. And it's been characterized as their party of two, McCarthy and Arendt. But I like to think of it through another phrase that was used to characterize this scene, which is that they were alone together. And I think that this is the kind of relationship they wanted to create between people who shared a world. So the image is of them looking out at the world, waiting for the subway, but doing it in each other's company, looking outward but together, right? So you're not looking at each other. And so much of our discussions in the past 50, 60 years about how to overcome some of the problems of otherness in the world and power differential have come out of the face-to-face encounter. And they're actually asking you not to reproduce the face-to-face encounter, but to share the world. And sharing the world is one of Hannah Arendt's most important concepts. That that's what politics is sharing the world from our different perspectives. But how do you do that? And it's, you can't just say, okay, we'll do it. What does that mean? So McCarthy spent a lot of time thinking about what it would mean to face the facts of the world. And for her, facts are really an interesting thing. So I'm going to just check my list because it's hard for me to remember, is that a fact is not just a piece of information. For her, it can be an occurrence in history, like the death camps, an event in culture, like a new art form or a new artist. A fact can be a document, like a novel or a transcript of a hearing. It can be a person, like Richard Nixon, or a character in fiction, like Charles Bovary. And these are all actual examples I've pulled from her work where she said this is a fact. So you cannot possibly know what a fact is by the what of it. You can only know it by what it does. And so for her, facts are these irreducibly disruptive parts of our world that cause us to change our opinion or cause us to revamp or reconsolidate how we view the world. And so they're always irritating, they're always impolite. And she was in the late 1940s, early 1950s, working to produce a magazine with Hannah Arendt and other people called The Critic. And the number one concern for her, which I find so interesting in light of our conversations about fake news now, is that she thought there wasn't enough facts in our public discourse and that we actually didn't and were unwilling to be disrupted by them in the way that facts should properly operate. That you know that if you're not in a little bit of pain, you are not actually absorbing that fact, that you're not being forced to alter yourself or to alter your consensus around something. So they saw certain forms of solidarity as actually anesthetic, because so it protected you from the pain of that encounter. And the pain of that encounter was the pain of self-alienation, finding yourself somewhat a stranger to yourself as you absorb some new fact about the world. And I just find that, so what that requires, and I can go on and on about what that requires stylistically, but I think that's just such an important thing, is that part of this discipline of unsentimentality is going to mean you are uncomfortable. You are in pain as a reader and also as a writer, right? That this should, so she tells this great story in an essay that I think many people know, but where she talks about a short story she had written and how embarrassed she was about herself after she had written it, because she was trying to pretend, she realized that she had made company with an anti-Semite in this weird way. And she said it was actually writing the story and capturing the details of that story, it's the real facts of that story, that made her so uncomfortable with herself. And she thought it would be uncomfortable for the reader, which indeed it was. So part of this mode of fact gathering, fact confrontation in this unsentimental, sometimes brutal way means you are going to be in a kind of perpetual state of discomfort if you're in a proper relationship to the world. And I think in some ways Hannah Arendt's and Mary McCarthy's unpredictability on certain kinds of issues was a result of their relationship to facts, their willingness to be altered by new facts. Both of them are quasi-aligned, or they're aligned with the New York intellectuals, but they were always pissing off the New York intellectuals, whether it was Eichmann in Jerusalem, or Reflections on Little Rock, or whether it was one of McCarthy's short stories, or The Group. And part of that was they were disruptive of the consensus, and sometimes an unspoken consensus. So I want to turn to another pair. You can kind of zigzag anywhere in the book from one or to the other of the writers, because they're all kind of trying to work through the same issues, but in their quite different idioms. I want to talk about Joan Didion. So Joan Didion was actually very much a student of Mary McCarthy, and you can see in her early work, most of you won't recall that earlier in her career she was what she called a utility infielder for the National Review, William Buckley's National Review, and she was one of their literary critics. And she is not nearly as good as she becomes later. You can see her figuring out her own style, figuring out her own aesthetic, and you can see her doing some what I think of as Mary McCarthy bits when she is trying to work these things out. But the very last essay she wrote for the National Review, which is sort of about where she's going to become a highly visible person, so it's like the early 60s. She writes about contemporary literature and its failure to grasp the weirdness of contemporary reality. And basically her argument is that the writers improvise their way into a cul-de-sac and then go limp. So there's a little phallic imagery in the description, but what she's actually goes on to elaborate, if you look at some other work from around that time, is that she wants to produce a certain kind of directness, again, painful directness, but it's in the realm of syntax here. So she wants writing shorn of qualification, like the ways that you're hiding your actual opinion, or you're trying to comfort the reader by not giving them the full expression of whatever thing it is you're to report, is causing you to kind of, the sentence is kind of collapsing and being eviscerated by your own lack of moral courage and your own unwillingness to actually wound the reader. Didion is very upfront about the fact that this is something you have to do, that as a writer it's your moral responsibility to, sort of, let's say, tell it like it is, but interpret it like it is, and give it to the reader. And if that disrupts their self-delusion, so be it. That's your actual job. So she accepts the role. I mean, I'm not sure McCarthy fully took in the fact that she was going to produce a lot of discomfort. She seemed to always be surprised by it. Didion was never surprised by it, right? She knew full well. So she writes a very provocative essay in the New York Review of Books called Unsentimental Journey about the rape of the Central Park jogger. And more or less what that essay is about how deluded New Yorkers are about the state their city is in, and the fantasies of being heroic for either the perpetrators or the victim. I mean, the perpetrators who ended up, obviously, as you know, being wrongly accused and rushed to judgment, or the young woman, but in no way facing a kind of the conditions that would produce such an event in New York and Central Park in the late 1980s. One thing that goes through these is the necessity, your discomfort in reading the work, which might speak to some of the scandal that surrounds the work, or some of this discomfort that's in the reviews of the work when it comes out. And then I'm going to turn last to Diane Arbus. Diane Arbus is one of the most important photographers of the late 20th century, and her show, her posthumous show, was an enormous controversy. It attracted more viewers than any show at the MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, had attracted since something called the Family of Man exhibit in the late 1950s. 100,000 people waited in line to go see this exhibit. You know that not many art shows produce lines. I mean, they weren't all in line at the same time. There weren't 100,000 people in New York waiting to get into Diane Arbus, but it was constantly packed, oversubscribed, and something like 200,000 copies of her of the exhibit catalog sold. And that's just like a popular selling museum exhibit catalog is just not a thing we know. It's just not a thing that happens. And part of it was, I think, and I think it's demonstrated in lots of the reviews of this work, is that people could not figure out what she was doing here. Was she being nice or not? Was she being cruel and voyeuristic, or was she being kind and empathic? And this debate has never ended around Arbus's work. Including there was a show in 2003, a retrospective of her work, which reintroduced many of the same issues. But now they've been kind of neutralized because we say, well, she's a genius, so we don't know. But I've taken Arbus's work to represent our confusion around how we look at what we might perceive as suffering. She did not necessarily see the subjects of her photographs as sufferers, but they were perceived by the people who looked at the photographs as sufferers, because she photographed sexual outcasts, genetic anomalies, nudists, and they were called freaks, if you want to conglomerate it. That was the accusation hurled at her work. And at the end of her career, or at the end of her life, I should say, she photographed some people in what was called a home for the mentally retarded at the time in New Jersey. And these photographs are really, really interesting. But Arbus had always said that she was not empathic. And I thought, well, why don't we just take it at her word, figure out what she thinks is going on here. And so she actually spent quite a bit of time, if we look at the last retrospective, figuring out how to make the camera capture reality. So she said one time in a class, you know, I love Ansel Adams, but I don't recognize what's in his photographs. He said, his trees look like Christmas presents. She said, you know, it's like, I don't have any objection to Christmas presents, but they're not trees. And she was saying, how could someone whose reputation for like clarity could produce something so unlike the world as she knew it, that she really thought the camera was not as, it wasn't so obvious that the camera could capture reality, that a lot of work had to go into that. And I'm not going to belabor all the different techniques that she used, but she actually spent quite a lot of time thinking about it and experimenting to produce what she thought was coming closer to the reality of the situation than accepting that distance and aestheticizing that distance. Yeah?
Oh, you just answered my question. Oh. Her objection was that she felt that Adams was prettifying.
That's right, okay. Exactly. And she said, I mean, in this way, she might, I mean, so I talk a lot about Susan Sontag's review of her work here, but Sontag said one of her axioms on photography is the photograph makes everything beautiful. Her one caveat to that is that dwarves are dwarves and not beautiful. So Arbus was like the one person who disrupted her system, which was really interesting to me. But yes, Arbus senses the same thing that Sontag does, which is that the photograph aestheticizes whatever it touches. So even if you take a picture of like a garbage can heaped over with garbage, and you do it in black and white, and you have really nice, contrast. It's like beautiful. It's not garbage anymore. She wanted to make garbage be garbage, or, and I'm not saying her photographs were of people who are garbage, but she wanted things to be what they were. And she demonstrates how technically difficult it is. And so if you work through some of those techniques and her various comments on the sociality of making photographs, she's basically saying you have to get away from being nice. And I think that her argument ultimately was that being nice makes that other invisible. Like your niceness becomes the frame of viewing, not who they are and what they are. And so she was trying to work past her niceness, not just as a social form, but as a technical and photographic problem. So I'm going to wrap up here with just one comment. One of the things in thinking through the techniques and the reception of this unsentimental work is that these real encounters with reality, if you want, leave us without certainty, predictability, or consolation. We're denied the gratitude of our sympathy, owed to our sympathy or empathy, since I'm saying it's actually kind of collapsed into the same thing, and we're denied the intimate company of others in these pursuits. So it's a pretty rigorous, pretty uncomfortable doctrine and practice, but for all of that, it's promising a more active and possibly transformative relationship to that reality if you accept the terms that you're offered.